welcome to this edition of IFI at Home with, a new series of virtual conversations about our favourite subject, the movies. My name is Dave O'Mahony, I'm Head of Cinema Programming at the Irish Film Institute, and I'm delighted that my guest today is a film correspondent from the Irish Times, all-round movie guru, and creator of fiendishly difficult film quizzes every Friday, which I'm sure you're all thwarted by on a weekly basis. Donald Clarke, delighted to have you here.
Hi Dave, how are you? Lovely to be here. Well, I'm always here, as you're always there, but lovely to be here together.
Through the magic of Zoom, we are brought together.
We are.
Donald, we're all eyeing the date of July 20th eagerly, certainly here at the IFI. This is the date we can once again open our doors after this extended and unexpected period of lockdown. Donald, during this period, what have you been watching? Have you been indulging in old favorites, or what has sustained you? Or are you finally getting to that 4-hour Latvian period drama that you somehow overlooked all these years?
Well, the first thing to say is that one aspect of that has not changed because, like most film writers and like the studios themselves, we kind of pivoted to streaming. So actually, a large part of what I've been watching is what I would have been watching anyway, is that's to say newish films that have been coming in for streaming, which I think which would be slightly painful for you to consider because a number of those would have gone to the IFI. Some may end up in the IFI eventually in different incarnations. But things like Never, I've titled, it was one of the titles you just can't remember. Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always, for example, by Eliza Hittman was a film which I imagine would have turned up in the IFI, I would suspect.
Absolutely.
Yeah, which is an excellent film. She's a poetic realist, did a great picture called Beach Rats a few years back. But this improves and develops on that. The Vast of Night, which actually is something that might not have gone to the IFI, is an interesting example of a film that we can't quite call it a lockdown cult, but close enough. But one of those films people were saying, hey, there's this thing on Prime, and they shared it around, and it's become something of a cult. Really interesting 1950s set science fiction film, alludes to Twilight Zone, goes in that sort of world, spooky and weird. And of course, also been watching, I mean, that's the upside. You're asking what I'm watching rather than what I'm recommending. Also watching all kinds of terrible films as well. For example, no offense to all those involved, but we had the Artemis Fowl back there last weekend, for example, which is another example. Interesting. It would come to write the history of the cinematic pandemic. That's one film that will figure. A film that Disney were, I don't know what their thinking was. I can't be into their heads, but I imagine they were happy enough to have it on. Well, there was their decision. Obviously, they were happy enough, but I don't imagine they were tearing much hair out. But the fact that it ended up on Disney Plus,
perhaps not. And Don, I must say you're touching a sore spot with The Vast of Night. It actually was a film I saw back in Toronto last year.
Oh, really? Yeah.
And I was in some. I suppose it doesn't matter now because it won't happen until next year. But we have a sci-fi event that takes place most summers called Dark Skies, and it was a film that I was tracking for that, and it was looking positive.
Oh, really? Okay.
It would have hopefully had a berth at the IFI, but then again, something changed. So
no, it passed me by Toronto. I must say I didn't see many reviews of it, positive or negative. So I was delighted.
No, it was the last film I saw. I remember having my bag with me. Shuttling off to the airport, and I thought it was very striking.
Yeah. In terms of what else I'm watching, I mean, one great victor of this, I think, in terms of the various streaming services, is Mubi. I was aware of Mubi before, as I'm sure a lot of cineasts watching this chat were, but it really took off during. It's been around in one for another for 10 years. I mean, it's been around for a long time, but I think it really kicked off the conversations on. I don't know what their figures are, but the conversation online suggests to me that really went bananas towards a few weeks ago, they decided to put all their library online so it doesn't appear on the lovely app that you get on, for example, I watched it on the PlayStation. But nonetheless, that's all available on the browser version. And it's one thing that pressed home to me. It's a funny thing about the streaming world we've been living in for the last 10 years, 15 years, maybe. Is how incredibly lazy I get about actually going and taking things down from the shelf and putting into the CD player or the DVD player. I watched all of the Dolce Vita a few weeks ago. I've got the Dolce Vita. You can't see my home here, but it is very small. Basically, there's a shelf there, which is where all the DVDs are, and the television is there. But nonetheless, I couldn't be arsed to watch
the app. Yeah.
Yes, until it was it appeared on Mubi a few weeks ago. Oh, I'll watch this, even though I have it in the house forever and ever and ever. I also part of the thing I watched Estrada as part of that season as well. In terms of things of older films that I haven't seen, and this again is a Mubi thing. It's a funny phenomenon. There's something often the case that you can go for years, decades, thinking you've seen a film when you haven't. You've got this idea in your head of what it's like. Yeah. And that was the case for me with Joseph Losey's The Go-Between, which was...
I would have assumed you had seen it 52 times.
Well, so would I.
Yeah.
And also, I'm a great admirer of Joseph Losey. I love The Servants, one of my favorite films. Accident, all those pictures that he made in exile in the 1960s in Britain. But somehow I never got round to The Go-Between. And despite the fact that I knew what Joseph Losey's films were like, somewhere in my head, a kind of Merchant Ivory thing that had sprung up, that had sprung up in the late 70s and 80s, had kind of not poisoned me to it, but I thought it's probably a nice, cozy film with kind of, with Judy Christie, sort of swanning elegantly round in delicate cinematography and long takes.
You're not wrong.
Well, I'm kind of am wrong, because the thing I wasn't with it is how kind of weird and angular it is. It's a really strange, aggressive sort of film in terms of how it's shot, how it's edited, and all those things. With a really terrific score by Legrand, Michel Legrand score. We're used to his kind of lush, elegant, but this is a really kind of like punchy, aggressive. So I was not knocked aside by that, despite the fact that I knew all about it and realized I haven't seen this, because I would have had a better grasp of the rhythms of the film and how unusual it was and how surprising it was for a period of adaptation of a novel that has become part of the canon.
Yeah. Well, Mubi, certainly from my perspective, I'm a big fan. The platform is terrific, but they've also committed to the theatrical space as well. They release films quite regularly. That was my relationship with Mubi. I mean, even up until just before everything happened, Bacurau was coming out, and Emma, that was again scheduled to be at the IFI. So they've committed to theatrical releasing as well as their marvelous streaming service. So more power to them.
Mm-hmm.
I must say the one film I plowed my way through over 2 sittings during quarantine. I think we may have talked about this. It was The Tree of Wooden Clogs, which was one of those films which I had on DVD, much like yourself, for 20 years, staring at me on the shelf, unwatched, and all the better for having done so. It's a remarkable film. But I can see why I didn't watch it.
Well, it is. I mean, the late George Byrne used to talk about double art house, the way you talk about double maths.
Absolutely.
And The Tree of Wooden Clogs is certainly in there, but in that category. But no, it's a terrific film. Well, I should say that, I mean, I've seen it all, for example, many times before. My point was more about this, that with that film was more that notion that kind of, I'm not prepared to watch it again if I have to stand up and walk across the bookshelf to watch it. But I am prepared to watch it again if I can just kind of like pick up the controller and do this while I'm already on the couch.
Yeah.
I suppose we should mention, I mean, it's not really the IFI's remit, but mentioned TV as well, which is, I had the strangest things that I have watched, going through all this. I had, for example, like a lot of people, had a kind of mad, sort of frantic rewatch of Mad Men.
I've noticed your Twitter activity.
Yes, because suddenly it popped up on the screen that it was vanishing from Netflix on, I think, June the 9th. I think it was about a week ago from the date of our recording this. But the thing I've watched again and again and again over the years that I watched, which I just downloaded all from Sky. I mean, sometimes these things appear on one of the Sky channels, and you're able to. I downloaded all 26 episodes of The World at War. Which, I mean, I'm not quite old enough to see the first time around. Well, I was alive, but I was a child. But I watched and I think firstly, it's terrific. I mean, it's very few technical things have aged. One thing that has aged technically, which is interesting, is that they put sound on all the silent footage, which is a strange thing. So if you see kind of a horse, the clip, 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 clop noises on the horse and those sorts of things, which to our eyes seems not even that it's inauthentic. It just seems aesthetically odd. Never mind that. The thing which really stands out and just demonstrates how long ago it is, I guess, is the people who they have who are still alive and often not that old, who
Yeah,
were being
yeah.
interviewed in
It's astonishing.
1972. It's like, I mean, people like Albert Speer turns up, and he's
Yeah,
like a man in late middle age. I mean, he's
yeah.
not an old guy. He doesn't look like an old guy at all. Admiral Donitz pops up. Like, who was, I think on submarines in the First World War. I think, my God, but what? And I believe that, having watched one of the making of things in the DVDs that I had before, that Jeremy Isaacs, who was the producer of the series for ITV, we should say, another one of those series that people often think is BBC but isn't, for Thames, I think. But Jeremy Isaacs said that was part of the reason they made it then.
Yeah.
Was this, look, we've got to make this now because people of Donitz's generation, people like Anthony Eden, who was still alive, Brad Butler, those politicians of that generation, they're going to start dying off, putting it quite soon. And so that aspect was one that always strikes you when you go back to it. But I watched that. In terms of newish stuff, I watched Giri Haji.
Oh yes, haven't seen this.
Yeah, funny. I really enjoyed it, but it's clearly flawed. It's not a great detective series. The plot isn't great, but it's so beautifully made that it kind of sweeps you up, and I enjoyed that very much.
I'll put it on my list. Before I change tack, just to say, you just reminded me, at Berlin, I saw a terrific documentary about Albert Speer's dalliance with Hollywood.
All right. Mm-hmm.
It was Carol Reed was attached to make a film of his biography, which he wrote in prison.
Right. Okay.
So that's knocking around. So watch this space. You never know.
I shall.
Donald, if I could bring you all the way back, what are your earliest memories, formative experiences going to the cinema?
Well, the very earliest, that's an interesting one. That I always distrust people who, in these questionnaires, say the first thing I saw in the cinema. I mean, I think even if you ask your mum and dad, they probably won't know. But the earliest memories I can think of, two kids' films. This goes to an interesting point, actually, about how distribution patterns have changed from when I was a child in the late 60s, early 70s to maybe as soon as the early 80s, this has changed. That films just popped up in cinemas. Oh, like there were rep houses. So the two I remember seeing were very clearly were Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. And
Terrifying.
And 101 Dalmatians.
Right.
Chitty Chitty Bang Bang came out in 1968 when I would have been alive but a little too young to go to the cinema. So that was probably a few years later. 101 Dalmatians was before I was born. But nonetheless, it's an odd one for you as an exhibitor now. Is it? My mum phoned up one day and said, "Oh, 101 Dalmatians on. You wanted to see?" What? She didn't phone up. I live with her. My mother said to me one day, 101 Dalmatians on. You want to see that? I see it's popped up in the cinema. And that was totally usual then. Yeah. Films just kind of like, had their order and they came back again.
Yeah.
They were available from the distributor. The exhibitor put them on. So I saw that maybe 5 or 6. Now, what's interesting thinking back about that, I think, is that of those two films, is the two things that are most resonant about them are the villains. And as you were saying earlier on, particularly the child catcher.
Oh, terrifying. Yeah.
Bizarre. And Robert Helpman is apparently a lovely man, it should be said. That famously appears in The Red Shoes, Australian choreographer. And anybody who spoke about him says that, why shouldn't he be? People who play villains, no reason it shouldn't be in that. But apparently the nicest of men. Plays the child catcher, not just as a malign figure, but actually, I would say, as our caricature of a predatory pedophile, right? I mean, he's like traveling around waving lollipops at kids. And I can remember, it's funny, and it took me, in retrospect, I worked this out. Mark Gatiss and others have done programs on the terrifying series of public information films that were screened on British television in the early 70s.
Donald Pleasance and Dark Water. And
that's exactly the ones.
Yeah.
And I can remember a series, which I don't think he has featured often, which were warning children about being abducted in cars. And this is what the story they always told. There was always somebody who was, I think wisely they often they didn't make them look villainous, because obviously that's the wrong message. You shouldn't expect the villain to look the villain. But nonetheless, and it occurred to me many years later, that actually these must have been coming in the wake of the Moors murders. That it was round about then that these things, all of which is an awful lot of weight to put on a film like Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. But every time I see that film, I think, my God, you wouldn't do that now. It's just too close to several unsettling truths. Underworld Dalmatians is entirely different. I mean, Cruella de Vil is a very different, it's entirely different. I don't ever remember being very that frightened of Cruella de Vil. I mean, I remember sort of thinking that, I mean, well, I think this, but if you'd asked me, I probably would have thought she might actually been quite good fun to be with. I mean, if she wasn't, turning your pets into coats, obviously, which presumably she would. But there was a sense of her actually being rather fabulous and rather good fun in a way that John Carter wasn't. The other thing I would say about my very earliest childhood experiences, going back to kind of late 60s, early 70s, is James Bond. It's very hard to describe how important those films were to us then. And again, I was seeing a number of them, some, not least because, this is something else about how things have changed, they were never on television.
Okay, yes.
James Bond films, like the Disney cartoons, which are still actually very rarely on television.
Yes.
James Bond films were never on television until, I think, about 1980. I think that sort of period. I mean, a good while after. Someone else can look this up and point out how wrong I am. But certainly a good while after the first one came out. So they were. You had to go to the cinema, and there was almost for us then as if there were like two classes of film. There was this very small class of film, which was James Bond films and everything else. Right. And they were kind of special in a way that everything else wasn't. I can remember, for example, a friend's dad one day saying, "Oh, he noticed that somewhere in Belfast, at a small cinema, again, years after so they both come out, that From Russia with Love and You Only Live Twice were in a double bill." So I'm calling this sort of 72 or 73. Okay. So, a good 5 years after one came out, good 8 or 9 years after the other came out, we went to see those two. And those were, I mean, they were just terrific. And it's for those reasons that, people of my generation find it a theological absurdity to discuss who is the greatest James Bond. There only is one James Bond. It's rather describing who is, like asking a monotheist who the greatest God is. I mean, there's no point having that conversation.
And keeping the chronological tone of this conversation, what are the films that have meant the most to you then over the years? I mean, like, what are, I suppose it's a roundabout way of asking, like, your favorite film.
I don't know. I mean, I find now that the films I go back to most often are films from the golden year of Hollywood, to be honest. I mean, I will go back and watch, if I'm randomly deciding I'll watch a film tonight, and it's going to be an old film, I would tend to watch a Howard Hawks film before anything else. Whenever I'm pressed into my favorite film, I always tend to say, just out of belligerence, Bride of Frankenstein, James Whale's film, which I'm sticking with. I mean, I haven't, revised that view in a serious way.
You did an introduction for that film.
I think I did an introduction for Frankenstein. I think, did I not?
Was it the Old Dark
Price? It was the Old Dark. Was it the Old Dark Price? Yeah, it was.
Possibly, yeah.
Which is James Whale film, which is also a terrific film, and in a very similar vein, in that it'll kind of be rated, and people rate kind of classic horror films. They'll put Bride of Frankenstein and Old Dark Price. It's but neither are really horror films in any kind of serious fashion. They're not particularly frightening. They're both essentially comic. They have an extravagant feel that you expect from somebody who comes from theatre in those ways. But those two films are the ones I stick with. And I think, again, I talk about kind of going through my life, is that I remember, I should mention Mark Gatiss very on. It's funny, another Mark Gatiss point is that he and I, he's a little bit younger than me, 2 or 3 years younger than me, remember watching all the Universal horror films on different divisions of ITV at the same time. A Friday night in the mid to late 1970s, and I was watching them on UTV. He was watching them on Tyne Tees in the north east of England, and so those have also been special to me. That stream of Universal horror films, that began with Dracula and Frankenstein, led through to Ghost of Frankenstein and Ghost of Dracula. Those films in the mid 1940s have always been at a special place for me as well. But I mean, the general answer to your question is, I think the golden era of Hollywood is the thing that I watch more than anything else. Now, films that are not, that obviously I grew up with on television, but obviously didn't see when they came out.
And is there a particular figure that you admire, actor, director, writer, whomever, that you feel has been overlooked or that hasn't gotten their due or somehow fallen through the cracks that you would like to shed light on?
I don't know. I mean, I've always had a great. Well, there's some things I will argue for, but I will argue for. This is not a particularly obscure notion. I mean, there are things that kind of people think filmmakers people think are underrated. They're not, because people have been talking about them forever.
They are rated.
People will still sort of say, "Oh, Douglas Sirk's melodramas of the 1950s. Why does no one take them seriously?" They've been taken seriously for decades. Nobody needs to reinvent themselves. But in a sideways angle to that, I do love the romantic comedies of Doris Day and Rock Hudson and other people. I mean, other people popped in. James Garner popped in for Move Over Darling. Rod Taylor was in. Cary Grant was in A Touch of Mink. I think they're terrific films. They occupy a strange place in terms of their sexual politics, because some people argue that they're quite liberated, and some will say that they're not, because although they are the best of being obviously pillow talk, though they are depictions of the hang around a liberated woman in a modern society who has, in that case, has her own businesses and interior designer. She ultimately gives in to the man in the end, and at the end of it all, that she does give in to the cad at the end. But I think they're incredibly funny films and sharp, and she was such a great comedian. I thought Strange Career died last year, the year before, at a great age, and virtually unseen for half a century. And that's one thing I point up.
You may be giving me ideas for future film season retrospectives.
Well, I think that's an interesting one. You can get all varieties of audiences into something like that, I think.
Yeah, right, for reappraisal. And Don, we're running out of time, so I just have two more quick questions to ask you, and bring it back to the IFI. Do you have any memorable IFI stories or anecdotes or particular Q&A that sticks out in mind? As again, to bring it back to the start of this conversation, we're all eyeing July 20th when we can finally reopen our doors. So do you have any fond reminiscences?
Well, it would be wrong of me not to mention, I suppose, the fondest reminiscence I have of the IFI would be 1997, when the premiere of a film that I wrote and that Paul Dwan directed, called My Dinner with Oswald. And it was a successful premiere, as I recall. Everyone seemed to like it. They applauded on the rooftops. A lot of really good Q&As there down through the years. In terms of incidents, one I remember, funnily enough, is a very obscure one, but this was a very strange. We talk a lot about the eccentrics who turn up at Q&As, who stand up and read out a manifesto, and then don't ask a question. Then sit down and ask a
rambling statement.
And I'm always impressed by those directors or actors, whoever it is, who are not shaken by this and just answer a whole other question. They just say, okay, and then they'll tell you something about the film.
They're to this,
as if this guy has asked a perfectly lucid question which somehow relates to what they're saying. But the one I remember was a Mark Evans film called "Imprisoned My Whole Life," which would have been the Dublin Film Festival. I'm saying about 2007. That sort of time, which was about the case of Mumia Abu Jamal, who I believe is still in prison, I think, seems miscarriage of justice in the United States. And at the end of it, there was a good film. Mark Evans, very nice guy. There was some sensible questions, all of which were, supportive of the film. And then basically this schism played out between two prominent left-wing groups in Dublin through the medium of this Q&A. And I can't remember who they were, so I can't be slandering them because I don't remember which groups were. But basically, on either side of the auditorium, I don't know if they were positioned according to their place on the left-wing spectrum, but they began yelling into one another because, this was just, I don't know if it's ideological divide or not, but it sprang from the fact that both of them had been campaigning for this guy. And one group had been campaigning purely on the grounds that the case was not secure. That's to say, the case was not proved. The other had been campaigning on the grounds that he was actually provably innocent. If you get that, which who would have thought that among far left groups that a small point of that precision would cause a schism? But the two that broke into this fight, it was sort of like, that's typical of you. That's what I expect from your lot, so forth. I remember that most clearly. But more possibly, I remember I'm going to call him Joe Verisophical, because he allows you to call him Joe Verisophical. That director of Uncle Boonley, who can recall his past lives. And we're a great Q&A with that in the IFI shortly after it won the Palme d'Or. And that's one thing, talking about things that we missed, Dave. I mean, we missed Cannes, for example, this year, that passed us by. And it'd be interesting to see, which of those films that were the films that Cannes said are part of their unofficial, official, selection, and those that we think probably were going to play but are not part of the list you read out a few weeks ago will turn up before the year is out. Hard to tell.
Yeah. Fascinating. Donald, before I leave you go, I'm going to put you on the spot. Favorite Irish film?
Well, we did a list of this in the Irish Times recently. We had fun with definitions. So what I'm going to say is this: I'm going to stick with our first. The first thing I'm going to say is I'm going to stick with our film. If you're allowing in Barry Lyndon, which I think you are, or I think you should be,
we should be
Barry Lyndon. But I know a lot of people think, no, you can't have that. It's all American money. It's all the various things. It's American director, all those things. I don't think you can go far wrong with The Butcher Boy.
Good choice. Good choice. Donald, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. We'll see you soon at the IFI after July 20th.
Yes.
Thanks so much.
Okay.